Okay, I know you guys are really excited about Thursday. There's going to be, it's all multiple choice. Personally, I hate it, but there's no way I'm going to grade on 20 essays. It's not going to happen. There'll be 50, and then there's going to, I've got about 17 extra credit, but you can only use 6. So I would, just so you know, I would answer all of them so that you have a better chance of at least getting 6 right. And that's an extra 12 points because each question is worth 2 points. Okay? So it'll make it a little easier on you. And now let's see what else. Oh, not everybody has handed in their or submitted their Darwinian snails. I just want you to know that the first week you get 20% off after it's due. The second week, 50%. The third week, you don't get any credit. And if you don't do one of these, you're probably going to fail the class. Okay? It's easy. You can't get worse than a B, but you can, unless you don't do it. Okay? Now, that also means you should read the syllabus because you're not just getting graded on the graded questions. You have to do all the questions, the ungraded as well as the graded. In fact, the ungraded accounts for 80% of the grade, and you get credit no matter whether it's right or wrong in terms of your answer. The only credit for right or wrong is the graded questions, okay? So if you haven't done it, you better get with it. Otherwise, you're going to come. I hate it when people come to my office and start crying and saying, well, I just did, right? So I want to make sure. Now, most people have done great, okay? But some of you are just think it doesn't apply to you or something. Okay. So, what's convergent evolution? Anybody? You know what convergent evolution is? Okay. Well, what does that mean? Is it because of their ancestors that they look like that, or is it because of the environment? The environment? No. The environment. No. It's the environment. Okay. This is important. There are 2 reasons that there are traits in organisms that look the way they do. One is they inherited it, the species inherited it from their common ancestor. Okay? That's homology. Remember what homology is. What's homology? Okay, homology is traits inherited from a common ancestor. That means, well, a good example is like we have 4 legs or 4 limbs because we have common ancestor that had 4 limbs. And all tetrapods, except for, all tetrapods are vertebrates on land that had 4 limbs unless they subsequently lost them. Okay? So, homology tells us whether something has been inherited, but as you can see here, on the left we have cactus, North America and South America. In the middle we've got this thing that looks kind of like a cactus, but it's not. And then in Africa, a euphorbia. They all look the same wide. What kind of habitat is that? Desert. Okay? So they have adaptations to survive where water is a premium. Okay? Now, these things are not related to each other at all. Okay? They didn't get that form from a common ancestor. They got it from living in the desert. In other words, that was natural selection. Evolution by natural selection is responsible for that sort of adaptation. That flower there, it actually smells like carrion. You know what carrion is? Dead, rotting meat. Okay, why? Anybody? What are flowers usually for? Here, I'll go ahead.
Pollination.
Pollination, okay. And who do you think is going to be pollinating this? What kind of an insect? Okay, well, what do you usually find on poop? Flies, exactly. And on carrion, they lay their eggs in it. So that plant is actually deceitful towards the flies. The flies think, oh, I'm going to lay my eggs here. So it's not going to do them any good. The eggs are going to die. But they pick up pollen and go to the next one. Okay? Well, that sort of thing, that sort of flower, is also in South America. There's plants with that. In Indonesia, there are plants that rely on the same sort of pollination. In other words, that kind of fly pollination is actually conversion, because the plants all rely on flies to actually pollinate. Okay. Now, on the bottom, these are nectar feeders. These are birds that feed on nectar. Okay? Except for one of them. So, the one on the left is an iiwi. It's one of the Hawaiian honey creepers. Many of the plants provide nectar for the pollinators, and many of the pollinators are actually birds in Hawaii. And so it's got a beak that will fit into the corolla down where the nectaries are. Okay? Now, you guys are probably familiar with hummingbirds. Most of them are found in Central and South America, but we have a number up here. They too have beaks that are adapted to getting nectar. In fact, there's some species where the males and females have different beaks because they feed on different flowers. The sunbird does the same sort of thing, but it's in Africa. So these are all examples of convergent evolution. Now, there's also that hummingbird moth. Obviously, it's an insect. It doesn't have a beak, but it has a proboscis that it then puts down the corolla, into the corolla of a flower. Okay, and gets nectar. So this is all convergent evolution. Okay, so we're going to talk now about what's called macroevolution. Evolution above basically species level. And so when we think about how species originate and diversify, if you have a new species that's, let's say, a new taxa that's starting to, differentiate, if there's already something there that is using that niche, it's unlikely that it's going to be successful. Okay? So, most new taxa, let's say you have a taxa that moves into a new area, they're not going to, all the niches, now the niche is what the organism is kind of like their job, lawyer, doctor, and it's also kind of the place where they're found. The niche for those nectar-feeding birds, that's their niche. They're all found in similar kind of habitats, but they're not related to each other. Okay? Now, when all the niches are filled up, it's very hard for new taxa to establish itself. It's kind of like king of the mountain, right? You're there and someone wants to knock you off. Well, you're on high ground. You actually have an advantage, okay? So incumbent taxa, that means the ones that are already there, are often more abundant and they've already had time to adapt to those environments. So it's very difficult for new taxa to actually get a foothold. Now, one way to do that is you can have some, let's say, invader that displaces the previous niche holder of that area. And that's called competitive displacement. Okay? In other words, they push them out. Unless, of course, they actually get more refined and kind of create their own niche. Now, the thing is, the potential for new taxa to establish is much more likely in places where there are lots of vacant niches. And there are a number of situations where that arises. Okay? Now, after a mass extinction, like the thing that wiped out the dinosaurs, first of all, obviously you had to wait thousands of years for things to settle down. Most of the species have been wiped out. Eventually, plants are, starting to grow again, all that kind of stuff. And there's all these new niches that are available. So after a mass extinction, after a certain amount of time of recovery, that's when you oftentimes get what's called an adaptive radiation. An adaptive radiation means that you start with a single species, let's say, and it turns into many, many, many different species. Okay? Like birds, because birds, dinosaurs had feathers, but birds have flight feathers. The feathers are actually asymmetrical. When these feathered dinosaurs started to fly, they had a whole new niche. In other words, they were able to fly around and get food by flying and all that kind of stuff. Okay? And so that's one of the reasons that we see birds radiate. In other words, a whole bunch of new species. And that, in that case, it was phenotypic innovation. In other words, something that's innovative and adaptive, like flight feathers, so they could fly. And those birds could suddenly access a whole bunch of areas and ways to make a living that really weren't there before without being able to fly. So, one way that's another way for an adaptive radiation. And a third way is that you come to an area where there are no competitors and there's ecological opportunity. And a good example is like the Galapagos or the Hawaiian Islands, where fruit flies and a bunch of different plant species and the honey creepers. An ancestor got there to one of the Hawaiian Islands, and then as each successive island started popping up, they dispersed to all those islands, and suddenly they created a whole bunch of new species because they were species were, or populations were somewhat separated between islands. And these are volcanic islands, and there's a lot of topography. There's deep valleys, there's dry areas like the Kona Coast of the Big Island. There's wet areas like the Hilo side of the Big Island. There are these lava fields where the volcanoes are, okay? So those are the three reasons that we often see adaptive radiations. Okay. Now, remember when I talked originally about ancestry, descent from a common ancestor? Okay. Well, that's like descent from a common ancestor is like birth, right? An old species that splits, giving rise to two new species or more. Well, species also die. They go extinct. As an example, okay, dinosaur. Some more dinosaurs here. They all went extinct. These other things didn't go extinct. There's still taxa that are around today, like look like sharks and various fishes, birds, mammals, amphibians. Okay, so we can see that there are, at each point, there are new species being created at each node, right? Pretty much like this, same thing. But also some lineages actually go extinct. Okay, so extinction is like death. For an individual, it's death for a species or a taxa. Okay. There's been lots of extinction events. Okay? We can actually look, we actually see all these peaks are kind of extinction events, but there's been 5 big ones, 5 mass extinctions. There was 440 million years ago between the Ordovician and the Silurian. There was a mass extinction. There was another one during the Devonian, Carboniferous. The Permian was the biggest one. And then there was a Permian-Triassic extinction, and Triassic-Jurassic extinction, and finally the Cretaceous. Okay? Now, these extinction events define geological time periods. We're talking geological time here. In other words, hundreds of millions of years. Okay? At least, in some cases, billions of years. When there's a mass extinction, you lose a substantial amount of the taxa, or the living kinds of organisms that are living at that time. In fact, you can lose whole classes of organisms, like dinosaurs, right? I mean, dinosaurs, there were a number of different clades, major clades. They're all gone except for one, and that's the birds. Okay? Now, the end Permian mass extinction was the biggest. It happened about 250 million years ago. This organism that we see here, that's a trilobite. Trilobites began in the Cambrian and went all the way up to the Permian mass extinction. In other words, they were around for 270 million years. Okay? Now, modern mammals, most taxa of modern mammals date to about 50 million years ago. Okay, so mammals haven't been around here for very long. Humans have only been around for 200,000 years. That's a blip. Their ancestors were here, probably starting around 6 million years ago. Okay, so you can see, now this is one of the most ubiquitous taxa. That means the most common. There were thousands of different species of trilobites in the oceans of that time, from the Cambrian all the way to the Permian. And they all went away. They perished in this mass extinction. It looks like it was because of volcanism, lots of chemicals released into the atmosphere. The seas became hypoxic. That means there wasn't much oxygen left in them. So, now, with mass extinctions, what they kind of do is, when they wipe everything out, they reset the clock. In other words, they kind of clear the decks of all or most existing species. The survivors are the ones that get to repopulate the Earth after that. So the trilobites had gone through a number of mass extinctions until they got to the Permian, and then they were gone. One of the most successful taxa of all time. So mass extinctions have a tremendous impact on biodiversity. First of all, it wipes a lot of it out, but then it creates conditions for new biodiversity, new kinds of organisms to evolve. And it's not like, this organism is better than another, because, and that's why there's so many of them. No, it's pretty much luck. I mean, it was bad. The trilobites had a great run, 270 million years, but they ran out of luck. Okay, they got wiped out. Eventually, dinosaurs, the same sort of stuff. Okay, so this kind of sets the stage for, after an extinction, for an adaptive radiation, where the remaining taxa that managed to survive create many, many, many new species that fill all these niches that were kind of wiped out and are now there. Okay. The dinosaurs. 66 million years ago was the KPG extinction in Cretaceous. For a long time, people they figured, well, maybe it was volcanism, whatever. But there was this geologist at University of California at Berkeley, and he noticed that in this very thin layer, at around 66 million years ago, there was this very thin layer of iridium. Now, iridium is something that on Earth is very rare, but it's also common with asteroids. So he hypothesized that, in fact, this is what actually accounted for the extinction. Now, it could have just been a coincidence of iridium, and then at that 66 million layer, older, there were dinosaurs. Above that, they were all gone. And a bunch of other taxa as well. So it looked like there was a mass extinction, and it could have just been coincidence that there was, let's say, a strike by an asteroid or a comet. But he also hypothesized that there would be a crater somewhere, and people started looking for it. Now, that's a prediction, right? Hypothesis. An asteroid hit the planet, caused a mass extinction, resulted in all this iridium and other things at this very specific layer. All these species went extinct in a very short order. And if that was the case, there actually should be an impact crater. And about, 12 or 15 years after, it was found. Anybody ever been to Cancun or Meridia? Right, okay. Well, right at the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, there's a crater that's about 110 miles across. Okay? And you can actually, it created a huge tsunami around the whole Gulf area. In fact, you can actually see how far inland it went. So we're not talking little tsunamis like we have. We're talking massive tsunamis. Okay. There were other things. There's this stuff called shock quartz that you only find in high impact zones where there's been melt and then reformation. Okay? And they've actually narrowed down when this happened to within 1,000 years in terms of the age of the rocks. And it looks like it probably happened very quickly. So there was probably initially 10, 15 years, kind of like a nuclear winter. There was a lot of stuff in the atmosphere. Plants were not able to produce food. All these things went extinct. Everything unraveled. And then over a period of a couple million years, the extinction followed until finally it settled and the environment stabilized, and then you started seeing new species or taxa speciating. Okay? So, it looks like dinosaurs, pretty big, pretty good. This is what you would expect. In other words, a prediction. Remember, we make a hypothesis, a prediction about what we're supposed to find. Now, we can't run this experiment, can we? We can't go back in time. But the evidence is pretty compelling. So, mass extinctions set the stage for rapid speciation of new taxa. They do it by, like I said, clearing the deck. All these other taxa and their niches have been destroyed. There's low biodiversity following a mass extinction that may persist for millions of years, but slowly over time, biodiversity gets recreated. Not the same biodiversity as what was before, because there's certain taxa that didn't make it. And then there's all these ecological opportunities because there's no competition going on. If all your competitors died, you have it pretty good. So the KT dinosaur killing extinction actually permitted an adaptive radiation of mammals. Now, remember, you can look similar to another species because of ancestry or because of similar environment. So, Australia didn't have any placental mammals. The Americas did. Okay? In Australia, all they have were marsupials. So there was this Tasmanian wolf. It's not a wolf. It's a marsupial, kind of looks like a wolf, had the same niche as a wolf, in other words, eating small mammals or other things that they could get his hands on, but it's not a wolf, okay? This is convergent evolution. The koala, similar, the same niche as what you would find with a tree sloth in South America. Let's see, Numbat and Tamamunda, that's an anteater. Up on top, kind of like a cat. It's called the western quoll. It's a mesocarnivore. In Australia, here we have things like ocelots. So all these different taxa and their niches are found in different locations because the environments are similar. That's all convergent evolution. And then another way is, of course, dispersal. So remember, the Hawaiian Islands are created from a hot spot where the mantle hits the surface and creates a new island, okay? And as the plates are passing over this hot spot, new islands are continually created. And so here we have the Hawaiian Islands. The oldest is Kauai. The most recent is Hawaii. Oahu came next. The Maui complex, and then Hawaii. And all these different taxa, from fruit flies to crickets to birds, somehow made it out into the middle of the Pacific and got lucky. And they landed on an island instead of landing in the ocean and dying. Okay? So when they got to the Hawaiian Islands, there were no competitors anymore. And they quickly speciated by way of allopatric speciation, island to island, and perhaps one side of an island to another where there was a big volcano in between, something like that. And there were also plants that same sort of thing. So ecological opportunity is another way through dispersal of getting from one place to another where suddenly there was lots of competition where you came from, and now there's no competition. Okay. And then key innovations. These are feathered dinosaurs. And they're displaying towards each other. We know they look like this because we've actually found pigments in the fossilized feathers. So it looks like this is what this animal might have looked like. It was a dinosaur. It couldn't fly. Had a tail, a mouth. Below it, we have perhaps one of the first birds, or at least a bird-like dinosaur. Okay? So feathers were originated for one reason initially, was for probably insulation. So individuals who, let's say, had scales on their body, perhaps there were these little protuberances of scales. Eventually, there was selection and they turned into feathers because it's basically the same sort of stuff. So you end up with insulation. You also can use feathers for display with all the pigments, but it wasn't until flight feathers originated that we finally saw birds actually take off, literally. Okay? So the lineage of birds that actually survived the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, it looks like that lineage was somewhere in South America, probably a few species, and now we have over 10,000 species of birds today. So this is an example of a key innovation that allows a living organism to take advantage of a place to live and make a living that wasn't there before.
Appeared as dinosaurs evolved from their earliest ancestors. It is by using the sequence in which those characteristics appear that we reconstruct the history of life.
Gautier found that dinosaurs and crocodiles parted ways 240 million years ago, when the ancestors of dinosaurs evolved the ability to stand up and run with their legs straight under their bodies. As the family branched out, the meat-eaters called theropods became more and more bird-like, acquiring traits like a three-toed foot, a three-fingered hand, a wishbone, and many others. Each new feature was passed along to the descendants. Finally, a branch led in one direction to Deinonychus, and in the other to Archaeopteryx and birds. With birds nested at the top of the dinosaur tree, linked to their ancestors by hundreds of inherited traits, Gautier says there can be no doubt about the family ties.
Birds are dinosaurs. That's why they look like dinosaurs.
And some dinosaurs look like birds. We now know there's one detail the makers of Jurassic Park got wrong. The raptors should have had feathers. The fossils from China proved it.
These are feathered dinosaurs. Okay. So, there's a whole bunch of evidence for homologous characters between birds and tetrapod dinosaurs. And that's how we know that, in fact, they're related to each other. Because the only other taxa besides birds with actual feathers are these feathered dinosaurs. No other taxa are like that. So, we have this tremendous biodiversity on this planet. This is all because of evolution. Okay? Even when it was decimated by a mass extinction, it recovered. Now, a lot of people think that perhaps we're entering another mass extinction because humans have really altered the planet, and there's a lot of things that are going extinct at a very rapid rate. And it's possible that that is actually what's happening, but it will not necessarily mean the end of life. Humans may disappear, and a bunch of other taxa, but eventually the remainder of taxa that survived will actually speciate into a whole bunch of new taxa. Okay. We're going to get to human evolution now. Our closest living relatives are the chimp bonobo, okay? And then there was all these other fossils that were found at various layers that have been dated. And you probably heard of like Lucy or Australopithecus that lived about 3.3 million years ago. By that time, the human lineage was already bipedal, walking around on two legs. It looks like the human lineage by that time, remember that mutation I talked to you about the chromosomes on the apes that joined and formed one chromosome on the human lineage. So here we have various things like perhaps bipedal adaptation. enlarged cheek and jaws. Now this is millions of years ago. The beginnings of large brains and the genus Homo. Smaller jaws, complex stone flakes and tool use. And then finally, a very large brain, small face, small brow ridges, art and symbolic logic. And those are modern humans. Now, it doesn't mean that, let's say, Neanderthals, which are very closely related to humans, didn't do some of those same things. They were pretty smart creatures. They went extinct, though, and we'll look at perhaps why. Okay. Now, it looks like bipedal evolution, by the way, bipedalism, walking on two legs, came before enlarged cranium or a large brain capacity. Mainly because you see bipedal species with a skull size of about a chimpanzee, in other words, pretty small, but at this point they're walking around. Now, human skin color is actually an example of convergent evolution. UV light, one of the things we need is vitamin D. And you need, in other words, sunlight, right? And if you've got really dark, if you're living in a place where there isn't a lot of sun, it actually is adaptive to have lighter skin. Under high UV light, there's a lot of vitamin D, but you have a potential of developing melanoma and cancer. And so you have darker skin. There's also another vitamin called folate. It's, I think, vitamin B or something like that. So we see the same sorts of things with skin color. We see dark skin, for example, the Aborigines in Australia. They have very dark skin. They also, a lot of them have blonde hair. You might think, well, maybe they got their dark skin from an ancestor who came out of Africa. No. Their ancestors did come out of Africa way before they got to Australia. Okay. So human skin color, usually we find where there's less light, lighter skin, and darker skin where there's more UV radiation. So it's adaptive. So the evolution of skin color has actually evolved independently many times. Okay? Africa, Australia, Asia, with varying kinds of skin color. So the first modern humans came out of Africa. They got into Asia, higher latitudes, less sunlight, lighter skin. They traveled through Southeast Asia, down into Australia, evolved dark skin. Crossed the Bering Straits during the last ice age into the Americas. Same sort of thing happened. Now, of course, one of the things that we're most proud of as humans is our big brains. Not that we use them very well, but we're proud of them nonetheless. Actually, you could perhaps make the case now that there's strong selection for smaller brain size. First of all, what's the cost of having a large brain? Anybody? Huh? Okay, thinner skull. What else? A cost, a real cost. Okay, real energy. In fact, our brains actually use about 20% of all the energy that we acquire through food. That's a tremendous amount for this 5-pound organ up here. In fact, that's very strong selection. If you don't need increased brain size and cognitive power, there's strong selection not to have it because it's so expensive to actually have large brains. So there has to be some reason that you're willing, that evolution has actually picked an adaptation where you get a real benefit from having a large brain. One of the benefits is being able to do puzzles. One of the benefits is, let's see, trying to blow off fireworks. There's all kinds of things that we get ourselves into. It's wonderful, yes.
I have a question. Through time, did we develop the left and right hemisphere?
No, that was
That was always there.
that's for all vertebrates. There's always been that. Okay. Now, there's a number of hypotheses for why an increased brain size evolved. Natural selection for the ability to reason and communicate. In other words, you need a large brain to do some of the things that we're able to do. Okay. And it was triggered perhaps by, we started using tools, strong selection, in terms of making better tools. Resulted in humans with larger brains, not just tools, but art, all kinds of different things. Now, I have a question. Do you think about the above paragraph, in other words, natural selection favored the ability to reason because of tool and language use? About the correct difference between cause and effect. Why not actually increase tool use and language were caused by selection for the ability to reason and communicate? This is where we get into correlation again. It's hard to tell many times what is actually the cause and the effect. Because these things kind of happen, of course, at the same time. Now, also, there's a number of hypotheses in terms of why intelligence actually evolved. One is the cognitive map hypothesis. In other words, being able to find yourself, find your way around. Now, it turns out, these are pinyon jays. They collect pinyon pine seeds, and then they bury them and remember where they are. And they might bury 10,000 seeds in a winter or in a fall, and they remember where they are. Okay. In other words, some people have very good map sense, but it's nothing like this jay or a Clark's nutcracker that can literally remember all these places. You could never do that. Not a chance in hell. So, but having a good map sense, certainly for humans, might provide a real benefit. Another one is that some perhaps sexual selection. In other words, intelligence is sexy. Anybody in here like intelligent mates? Okay. Would you rather have an intelligent mate or a good-looking mate?
Intelligent.
Good-looking. So here's Einstein, right, with a buff body. Another is the most intense environmental effect on you in here is the social environment. You have to read other people. You have to know, can I trust this person? How might I get this person interested in me? So, the social brain, it was thought that perhaps intelligence evolved in highly social organisms so that they could make their way around and successfully navigate their social environment. And then there's something called theory of mind. In other words, consciousness, or they usually kind of measure it in one way. Does an organism recognize itself in the mirror? Lots of apes do this. Turns out elephants do this. Parrots do this. I think dolphins. Others, like a cat, they look in the mirror and they think there's another cat and they go crazy, right? Right? Okay. So that's another. So that theory of mind is kind of being able to place yourself in someone else's shoes and think, so what are they doing here? If I was them, what would I try to be doing? Well, they look at me and they think I'm an easy mark. So I bet you he's going to try to steal things from me, and he might kill me in the process. I'll know what I'll do. I'll kill him first. Right? Very effective. Okay. Now, our closest living human relative, they're extinct now. Well, they're almost extinct. Are Neanderthals. So Neanderthals, the guy on the left, probably 5'5", maybe 5 foot tall, may have actually weighed about 280 pounds, really big bones, massive muscles. They tended to hunt big ice age animals. They also had an ability for their bones to heal very quickly for fractures, okay? Now, on your right is a Cro-Magnon, or we'll say a modern human. Not nearly as massive, but taller. Okay? And we can actually look at the skeleton of each. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is there is a closed rib cage for Neanderthals. There is an open rib cage for modern humans. But occasionally, like the tail that I was talking to you about, where some humans are born with a tail, occasionally you have a human that actually is born with a closed rib cage, indicating that it's kind of a vestigial trait, or that was a holdover from the past. Now, okay. It looks like there was also another group of humans that were living at the same time, called the Denisovans. Their only remains were found in a Siberian cave, but their genes have been found elsewhere. And if you look at human alleles, you see there's up to maybe 99 different base pairs in the mitochondrial genome. Between modern humans and Neanderthals, there's 202, and between Denisovans, there's 385. So who's probably more closely related to us, the Denisovans or the Neanderthals? Huh? What do you think? Make a guess. Why? Right, so there's Neanderthals, there's less difference in terms of the allele differences compared to Denisovans. It looks like the humans and then the Neanderthals and Denisovans diverged about 1 million years ago and went on their merry way. So there were at least 3 species in Eurasia that coexisted over the last 100,000 years in Asia. In Africa, there were also modern humans. They didn't breed with Neanderthals because Neanderthal breeding with human, well, we're going to talk about that. Okay, so here's the Denisovans up here. This is Neanderthal, kind of roughly where they're found. And then this is human migration down into Australia. So now the thing is, they've actually found, normally I would say you can't, DNA doesn't fossilize, but it does. Limited. Usually it degrades and you get these small pieces and you've got to piece it all together. But you can use a scaffold, like a human genome as a scaffold to rebuild it. So they've actually recovered Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA and compared it to human DNA. Now, we're about 98.4% similar in our DNA to chimpanzees. We're even much more so than we are compared to Neanderthals. So there's a number of different hypotheses about where modern humans actually originated. And some of the predictions are that there's a time and place where anatomically modern humans originated, and that should affect the amount of genetic diversity. In other words, if you find the oldest modern human fossils in one location, and compared to, let's say, a widespread, you can perhaps figure that there was one place where modern humans originated from and then spread out from there. The longer a population has been in a certain place, the more time for mutations to arise, and there's generally a lot more genetic diversity. So in the original place, okay? Now, there were 2 hypotheses for the longest period of time. There was the out of Africa hypothesis. In other words, our ancestors originated in Africa a couple of 100,000 years ago and then spread out. Or this multi-regional hypothesis where populations of humans spread out and then there was gene flow between each, and you eventually ended up with kind of a blend of different modern human lineages. Okay? Now, in terms of species definitions, one of the definitions is the biological species concept, which says that a species is a group of individuals or a population that can interbreed with themselves and produce fertile offspring, but not with others. Unfortunately, with dead things, you don't know whether they could perhaps interbreed. Or at least we didn't know that until we started actually recovering ancient DNA. A guy named Svante Pabo, living in Germany now. He was from Sweden. Was the first to do it with mummies and then with Neanderthals and all that. And there was another hypothesis. Perhaps the original humans that came out of Africa perhaps started trying to breed with archaic humans elsewhere, like Neanderthals. And if that was the case, you would predict, of course, that we should be carrying DNA from Neanderthals in us. So, this is a table, and in terms of what we find and the kinds of things that we expect as the predictions. So, in the multi-regional hypothesis, anatomically modern human fossils should be found randomly distributed across Africa, Eurasia, and Australia. In terms of the out-of-Africa hypothesis, the oldest fossils should be found in Africa. And the admixture, where there's some limited interbreeding, also from Africa. Location of ancestral alleles that are still in a place where they originated but haven't traveled elsewhere. For multi-regionally, you'd say you predict there's no consistent pattern, but in out of Africa, you would say there's alleles that are found only in Africa. In fact, there's the greatest amount of genetic diversity in humans is in Africa, by far. There are African populations that are as different as Chinese and other Africans or Europeans. Okay? Now, divergence time. Multi-regional, you predict that it's greater than 1 million years ago because you've got this big kind of population that's interbreeding. But in terms of out of Africa and admixture, less than 200,000 years. The greatest genetic diversity should be pretty much equal in all three regions, much greater in Africa. Now, in terms of gene flow, the out of Africa hypothesis does not predict that modern humans actually interbred with Denisovans or with Neanderthals. Multi-regional says, yes, there was lots of gene flow going on with this very large human population. Out of Africa says no. Admixture says yes. Now we know, in fact, that modern humans actually bred with Neanderthals because it turns out we carry Neanderthal DNA in us. Europeans and Asians have about 2% Neanderthal DNA. The interbreeding probably happened after modern humans left Africa and ended up in the Middle East and encountered Neanderthals. And then Melanesians in Southeast Asia and Australia, like the Aborigines, they show evidence of interbreeding with Denisovans. So we sequenced those as well. So this is kind of the dispersal, what it looked like, perhaps. Originated here. We find various modern human fossils in South Africa from 150,000 years ago. In the Middle East, about 100,000 years ago. Modern humans didn't make it into Europe until about 40,000 years ago, where they overlapped with Neanderthals. East Asia, 30,000. And then there was a group that went through the Denisovans in this area and then carried that genetic material down to Australia, New Guinea, and some of the Melanesian islands in the South Pacific. So here's the fossil evidence, of course. I'll go through this quickly. The earliest fossils were found in Africa. Modern humans don't even show up in Eurasia or in Europe until about 40,000 years ago. Genetic diversity. Each of these dots is a different allele. What you would expect is that if the population started in Africa, it would have the most genetic diversity, and then as the population is spread out, you'd start getting a founder effect where you lose alleles. Okay? So the founding populations would successively, over time, lose alleles as they traveled. Less, and then finally into North America, where there's even less. And then there's very strong evidence now of interbreeding between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals and Denisovans. The thing is, people have been looking. So the question is, were they a different species in terms of the biological species concept? If they were interbreeding, does that mean they're the same species? Yes? No? Yes? No? Okay. If it's the same species of individuals within a population can interbreed with themselves but no one else and produce fertile offspring. The thing is, there were fertile offspring, well, there were offspring produced between Neanderthals matings and modern human matings. That's why we have Neanderthal DNA in us. But it looks like modern humans and Neanderthals, the females were viable, kind of like female mules sometimes are viable. But the males weren't because of genetic incompatibility that affects sperm and reproductive physiology. And so what we're seeing is when we actually look at the X chromosome, we find that the X chromosome in humans has almost no Neanderthal DNA in there at all. In other words, it should be there, but it's been wiped out because of strong selection. In other words, it's been producing offspring, but that are probably sterile. In other words, the males are probably sterile. So that's kind of the current, where we're at. It's ongoing in terms of this ancient DNA and discovering kind of where we came from. African populations also interbred with archaic humans in Africa. There's evidence of that, so integration in that as well. Okay. So it looks like the most support at this point is kind of like the admixture hypothesis. These things make predictions, right? And we follow the predictions. Okay. Do individuals evolve? No. Only populations. Okay? Now individuals do change. I mean, I don't look anything like I used to. I used to be 6'2" with blonde hair and blue eyes. And I'm different now.
But individuals mutate, right?
Well, our somatic cells have mutations. Some of those mutations actually turn into cancer, for example. Okay? Now, evolution requires a will to adapt. Yes, no, no. First of all, bacteria evolve, and they don't have a brain nor a will. Okay? So, all it is that individuals are dealt the hand they're dealt with and the traits they have, and if those traits are beneficial, they're passed on to future generations. Some people think that evolution is progressive. In other words, humans were the natural, they predicted the outcome of evolution. How else could it be, right? Because we're the greatest. Well, I just want you to know that human evolution is still ongoing. There are still populations that are evolving. For example, lactose tolerance is a new thing in the last couple thousand years. A bunch of other things. We're living in much different environments. So there's a bunch of other things that I go in terms of questions that you can go through on your own. But that's pretty much it. We've covered everything. And it's enough to give you a headache, I know. So good luck. Let's see, you see a pattern in terms of evolution because of common ancestors. And then you see divergence in terms of selective environment. So the main thing is recognizing
Program.
It's like, it's kind of like the
well, what I did is I did independently come up with the idea of ancestors, descendants from man, descendants from man, and natural selection as well. He just came up with it about 15 years later. Okay? So independently, I mean, the idea is they didn't learn it from someone else. They came up by themselves. Okay? Yeah.
Oh, well, sure, it's here first.
Yeah. 882. Okay. So it's a standard Scantron. There's 50 questions on each side. We're only going to use one side. That's it.
If I go to all this, then you got it.
Yeah. 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 And also what's on top of it.
Yeah, exactly. I already learned.
Okay. So that's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah. I'll do it right now. I would look through them, but mostly we're going to be following lectures and kind of the questions that are covered in the top half. Okay? Yeah. But I would read over this stuff. They're small chapters.
You know, like, just like, oh, what's up? Then there's something.
Yeah. Yeah. You should have.
I know. I was shocked.
And did it show anything to grade question?
The grade was said like how you joined all of us.
The numbers were just supposed to be.
Something happened here, so I might have to do some
Because I checked the right class too.
It sounds
And
like,
I'm
yeah.
done with
Okay, so there's something going on, because I'm sure you've got 22 or something like that. Well, what do you have? What kind of computer? Okay, so PC. And what operating system? No, that's Chrome, I mean the operating system. In other words, Windows 7.
I'm gonna call your name.
Okay. Email me. You should have emailed me way before. Okay, so you know you're late. Okay, I just want you to understand that in a couple of points. Okay, email me and we'll get it figured out. But if you have a problem with something, you have to be proactive. You can't just sit there and think it's going to get fixed. Well, I know that, but it's not happening. First of all, I'm really waiting until the end. Okay. Okay, so that's the first thing. So then at the end, something comes up and you're not prepared for it, and then you're late. You have to be proactive.
I'm gonna
Okay,
call
so from
all,
now on, if you don't understand something,
including everybody.
then contact me immediately.
Thank you.
You have to do that. Okay, I don't want you losing points for no reason. So email me, and I'll put you in touch with Symbio support and figure out what's going on. Okay, and then I'll give you at the most you'll only lose,
I don't like the way they run it. Like, this is organized, one, 18 minutes, but you know,
Oh, you are very sophisticated. You have a
Yeah, I know.
PC, you have a laptop.
yeah, I know, I got it all of it. iPad,
iPad, everything.
everything. So I have all my lectures on this. Yeah, because I'm cool. What can I say? Oh, there's this. Okay. Yep, it's all yours now.
that's how it was in my school.